Hey guys, tonight we begin with a warm, steamy bowl of medieval misery. Imagine this: you open the heavy groaning door of a 14th century tavern, and you're hit in the face not by a warm welcome, but by a cloud of damp wood smoke and the unmistakable tang of overcooked onions and wet dog. Somewhere nearby, someone is singing off key, someone else is snoring while fully awake, and the floor is sticky. You're not sure if it's spilled ale or someone's regrets, but you are very sure that you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fun to see which poor souls around the world are sharing this descent into historically accurate discomfort. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The door shuts behind you with the reluctant creak of old wood that's seen too much. Welcome to your home for the night, a medieval tavern, a place that promises shelter, food, drink, gossip, music, warmth, lice, mild violence, and possibly spiritual reflection if the stew goes down wrong. The moment your boots hit the rush-strewn floor, you realise this isn't a curated reenactment. This is reality, sweaty, smoky, unsupervised reality. Taverns were the social heart of medieval towns. Forget castles or courts, those were for the wealthy and occasionally beheaded. Real life pulsed through establishments like this, and unlike modern bars, taverns weren't trying to be cool, they just existed. They were places where farmers, blacksmiths, pilgrims, and the odd wandering monk all mashed together in pursuit of warmth ale and a night where you hopefully didn't lose a tooth. Your first obstacle is spatial awareness. The ceiling is low enough to kiss if you're over 5'7", and the air is so thick with smoke you feel like you're aging a century just breathing. The tavern is dim lit only by candle stubs and the flickering hearth. Shadows shift everywhere. You spot a bench, but before you reach it, you're nearly impaled by a man brandishing a wooden spoon like a sword. He's not threatening you, he's just passionate about soup. And speaking of soup, or whatever that substance is bubbling in the corner, your nose detects at least 7 different smells, 4 of which you can't name, and one that might be turnip adjacent. Welcome to medieval cuisine, but we'll come back to that tragedy in a bit. The people here are loud, animated, and thoroughly unconcerned with your personal space. One man loudly claims he once arm wrestled a bishop. A woman nearby shouts that she traded a chicken for a miracle. Someone's laughing with that deep, loose kind of laugh that only ale and a total absence of dental care can produce. You try to keep your belongings close, which is ironic because you're dressed like a time traveller, and they can already smell your softness. Your boots are too clean. Your shirt doesn't smell like goat. You might as well have walked in with a sign reading, "Please rob me, I trust easily." But don't worry, everyone's too busy watching the room's unofficial performance, a man singing a bawdy tune about a monk, a pig, and a misunderstanding involving a bucket. His voice could peel paint, and judging by the wall behind him, it already has. The innkeeper, who looks like he was carved out of ham and fermented disappointment, spots you and raises a bushy eyebrow. His expression says, "Are you here to pray or pass out?" You give the universal nod of yes, and he waves you toward the communal seating, a long battered table, slick with grease history, and a faint smear of something reddish-brown. You decide not to investigate. As you lower yourself onto a bench that protests under your weight with a crack, you realise you've just entered the medieval social arena. There are no private booths here, no candlelit corners for solitude. You're now shoulder to shoulder with a man whose beard contains crumbs from 3 centuries, and a woman gnawing on something with the casual intensity of a lion with a vendetta. Historians still argue whether taverns functioned more like local hangouts or transient lodgings. The truth is likely both. Depending on where you were in Europe, taverns could be owned by brewers, private families, or the church, which made for some weird sermons when Father Thomas also served as bartender. And now that you've sat down here comes the first ritual, the stare. Every head turns slightly toward you. You're new. You smell strange. You have all your teeth. They want to know if you're a pilgrim, a noble in disguise, or just a poor fool who thought travelling sounded fun. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. One old man leans in and whispers, "Don't touch the stew unless you want to hear colours." You laugh, but he doesn't. He just blinks and says, "I haven't digested properly since Pentecost." Quirky, yes. But taverns were also places where news spread. In a world without phones, newspapers, or the soothing chaos of Twitter-ins were the original media hubs. Gossip, politics, scandal, all filtered through beer breath and questionable memory. And remember, you haven't even ordered food yet, but we'll get there. First, it's time to play a little game we call "What's that smell and is it dangerous?" As your eyes adjust to the gloom and your lungs acclimate to the medieval atmosphere, which is 30% oxygen, 70% regret, you finally realise that surviving this tavern won't be about strength or cunning. It will be about endurance. Enduring the noise, the smell, the food, and above all, enduring the stew. Speaking of which, the ladle is dipping again. There's a moment in every medieval traveller's evening where hope dies. That moment usually arrives when the innkeeper or someone who may or may not be related to him, but definitely has the same forehead scar, slaps down a steaming bowl of something in front of you, and walks away without explanation, apology, or warning. Welcome to the signature dish of tavern dining stew. To call it stew is generous. You glance at the surface, which has the consistency of wet clay and the colour of decisions made in darkness. Something floats. It might be meat, or a root, or a rat with ambition. You try to inhale courage, but you smell turnips, onions, maybe garlic, and something that shouldn't be bubbling like that unless it's part of a volcano. This is not your grandmother's carefully layered herbaceous broth. This is whatever was available this morning, suspended in history's murkiest gravy. Historians agree stew was a staple of medieval tavern fare, not because it was good, but because it was nearly impossible to mess up unless you tried, which based on taste, someone might have. Let's talk ingredients. If you were lucky, you got rabbit. If you were extremely lucky, you got fresh rabbit. If you were everyone else, you got squirrel pigeon, or some vague piece of a creature that no longer has a Latin name. Fish only if you were near the coast, and even then it might have been swimming in that pot for a few too many days. Here's a fun fact: the pot never really emptied. Medieval taverns often kept the stew going continuously, just topping it off with whatever they had. Monday's stew becomes Tuesday's stew, which becomes Thursday's mistake. This was called perpetual stew. A concept historians still argue about, some calling it genius, others suspecting it was a survival mechanism for those who no longer feared death. To make it worse, seasoning wasn't something people used to improve flavour. It was something they used to hide flavour. A dash of sage, some cloves, a generous handful of salt, all tools of deception. Anything to distract from the fact that the meat had once been room temperature too long. And then there's the bread. Ah yes, the trencher, a hard flat piece of bread that could double as a plate and a weapon. It wasn't meant to delight the palate. It was meant to soak up the stew so you didn't have to ask what was in it. Once it had absorbed the liquid and softened into a sad edible sponge, you were supposed to eat it, if you could stomach it. Otherwise it was handed down either to the poor or to livestock, both of whom probably developed deep trust issues. At this point you might think, well, at least I have utensils. And yes, you do, sort of. A knife and a spoon. Forks were rare, controversial, and suspiciously effeminate to many medieval diners. Most folks just used their fingers, which is fine until you realise those fingers were previously used to pet dogs handle coins, slap neighbours, and absolutely not wash anything. Ever. So you dive in, because what else are you going to do? It's either this or starve, and starvation takes time. The stew only takes about 30 seconds to make you question your life choices. You choose something fibrous and silently pray it's parsnip. You bite into something crunchy and convince yourself it was a potato. You find a hair and pretend it's yours. And in between you sip ale that tastes like it was brewed by someone angry at hops. Despite all this, no one else around you seems bothered. They're laughing, burping, dunking their trenchers like it's fondue night and smacking their lips with enthusiasm that feels suspicious. Maybe it's the ale. Maybe it's the collective acceptance of fate. Or maybe their taste buds just gave up around 1325. Somewhere near the hearth, a toothless man stands and declares the stew to be the best he's ever had. Then again, he's wearing one boot, one sandal, and a vest made entirely of rope. So you recalibrate your standards. The stew, however tragic, served a purpose. It was filling, it was warm, it required minimal teeth, and it was a great equalizer. Everyone, from merchants to monks, had to suffer through the same brown slurry. In a weird way, that shared suffering brought people together, like a support group, but with more indigestion. Even the quirkiest travellers developed coping mechanisms. Some would pour extra ale into the bowl, diluting both flavour and memory. Others kept spice pouches, little cloth sacks of herbs, or ground mustard they'd carry to make the food tolerable, or at least different. One curious trick recorded in a few journals was to blow on the stew while muttering Latin prayers as if invoking divine intervention over dinner. You look up from your own bowl and make eye contact with a local woman across the table. She grins. Her teeth are eclectic. She taps her bowl with her spoon and says, "Don't worry, the aftertaste goes away after a week." Then she cackles and goes back to chewing something with unnerving focus. And in that moment, something changes in you. You realise this isn't a meal. It's a rite of passage, a culinary hazing. A test to see if you can survive medieval life, starting from the digestive system upward. You keep eating, not because it's good or nutritious, or even morally defensible, but because this is how it's done. You've entered the great tradition of travellers who have all at one point stared into a bowl of mystery stew and chosen defiance, or resignation. It's hard to tell the difference by the third bite. And as the last soggy piece of trencher disappears into your mouth, you feel a strange kind of victory. You've eaten medieval stew and lived to tell the tale, assuming your stomach agrees in the morning. Now, if only your drink weren't chewing back. The ale arrives without a word, without a smile, and without any regard for the laws of physics. It sloshes into a heavy wooden mug, already stained with the memories and bacteria of 100 previous hands. There's no head of foam. There's no carbonation, and absolutely no chilling. It's lukewarm, thick as porridge, and has the distinct hue of something that once tried to be beer but got distracted halfway through and became soup instead. This, dear listener, is your beverage for the evening. Not because you ordered it, ordering implies choice, but because water will send you to the monastery infirmary faster than a bad decision in a dice game. In medieval taverns, ale wasn't just a drink, it was a survival strategy. You take a cautious sip and your mouth recoils. It tastes like liquid bread left too close to a fireplace, brewed with equal parts barley and confusion. But this is normal. This is good ale by 14th century standards. Historians agree that most ale was unfiltered, barely fermented, and occasionally included bonus ingredients like herb soot and the occasional insect. And you'll be drinking a lot of it. The average medieval adult consumed upwards of a gallon of ale a day, a whole gallon, partly because water sources were frequently contaminated by dead animals, human waste, or that one guy named Geoffrey who kept bathing in the town well, but also because ale had been boiled during brewing, which made it ironically safer than the priest's sermons about eternal purity. That gallon, by the way, wasn't optional. Taverns were legally required in some parts of England to keep bread and ale available at all times. Not fancy bread, not drinkable ale, just present. It was less about hospitality and more like municipal damage control. People with full bellies and buzzed heads tended to riot less, stab slower, and complain in ways that could be ignored. And then there's the thickness. Some ale was so dense you could allegedly stand a spoon in it if you had a spoon, and if it hadn't dissolved in the mug. The kind of ale that clung to the inside of your throat, like it had separation anxiety. This wasn't the fizzy refreshment of modern pubs. This was medieval fuel. A thick room temperature slurry designed to calm the nerves and soften the horrors of whatever mystery meat had just traumatized your tongue. Yet surprisingly, the locals loved it. They gulped it with joy, smacked their lips, and shouted to the heavens with frothy grins. One man near you just declared it as smooth as the bishop's chin, which raises uncomfortable questions about both his religious beliefs and his hobbies. Let's pause for a quirky tidbit. In some villages, ale testing was an actual job. Official ale conners would sit on benches soaked with spilled ale to determine its quality. If the seats stuck to their leather breeches, the ale was declared too sweet or under-fermented. And if you think that's ridiculous, remember someone somewhere made that their career. Sticky Butt Inspector, that's a title no one ever embroidered on a tunic. You take another sip and try to focus on the room around you, hoping distraction might overpower taste. The tavern is getting louder. Ale has a way of making everything more dramatic. Conversations shift from weather to battle stories, from harvests to hauntings. One man insists he once saw a ghost behind the brewery. Another woman claims her uncle was cursed by a jealous goat. These stories all end in laughter, slaps on the back, and someone losing a bet. The ale flows, but not for free. If you can't pay, the innkeeper has options: collateral labour, or something worse, being put in charge of cleaning the chamber pots. And if you think that sounds like a minor punishment, please remember that medieval diets included a lot of barley beans and mystery stew. There are tortures that smell sweeter. Still, the ale plays a role. It turns strangers into companions, loosens tongues, and primes the night for whatever chaos follows. Arguments are louder, singing is bolder. The line between a joke and a challenge becomes so thin you could slice it with a dull spoon, and all of it is soaked in ale. One historian once described medieval ale as liquid mood management. It numbed the cold, blurred the hunger, and most importantly, kept the tavern from collapsing into full-blown despair. Because let's be honest, you're sharing stew with a rat-shaped object and trying to digest in the company of a man who thinks bathing is a sorcerer's trick. You need something to take the edge off. But beware, not all ale was created equal. Some taverns, trying to save on ingredients, watered it down illegally. Others used old barrels that hadn't been properly cleaned, resulting in a flavour profile best described as oak smoke and regret. And in places where refrigeration was just a myth your grandchildren would invent, spoiled ale wasn't uncommon. You'd know it had turned when it fought back. You glance down at your mug and notice a small chunk of something floating. Is it barley bread? A warning from the gods. You swirl the mug and hope it dissolves, but it only rotates slowly, like it's daring you to take another sip. You do, because now you're invested. You've come this far. The warmth of the ale hits your belly like a torch. Not a comforting hearth fire, but more like someone lit a candle inside your stomach and whispered, "Good luck." A hiccup follows. A burp tries to escape. The man beside you cheers. First one's free, he yells, raising his mug. You clink it half-heartedly because you have manners, even if your liver is filing a complaint. As the mug's empty and the room gets blurrier, you begin to understand why medieval people clung to ale. Not because it was delicious or healthy or clean, but because it helped them forget. Forget the aching feet, the smoky air. The stew you still suspect included feathers. Ale was the amnesia they could afford, the social glue. the courage in liquid form. And now that you're courageously tipsy, it's time to ask the real question. Where are you supposed to sleep tonight? You don't remember finishing your mug of ale. In fact, you're not entirely sure you even drank all of it. Some of it might still be soaking into your sleeves. But what you do know is that your legs are starting to feel like overcooked cabbage. Your eyes are heavier than the stew, and you've begun to see the appeal of horizontal living. So naturally you look for a bed. Oh, sweet summer child. Beds in a medieval tavern, a less private sanctuary, and more communal crash pad for the desperately tired and dangerously unbothered. Forget fluffy pillows and turn-down sheets. You're not here to be pampered. You're here to survive and to not roll off onto the floor unless absolutely necessary. You approach the innkeeper, or at least someone with an apron and a limp, and ask about sleeping arrangements. He gives a grunt that might mean follow me, or might just be a commentary on your face. Either way, you follow him toward the back of the building, dodging elbows, spilled stew, and one very enthusiastic goat that appears to live here rent-free. The sleeping area is exactly what you feared, a long, low room that smells like old socks, wet straw, and a faint suggestion of ham. Candles flicker in wall sconces, made from bent iron and wishful thinking. You hear snoring, already deep, guttural, apocalyptic snoring, from a man curled on a bench with a chicken perched on his back, like a nightmarish pillow. Beds, you ask? No, we do mattresses here. And by mattresses we mean sacks of straw that squeak when you breathe near them. If you're in a luxury establishment, the straw has only been mildly used. If not well, it's basically a habitat. Bedbugs, fleas, lice. These aren't pests here, they're roommates. Some even have names. There are two basic rules to sleeping in a medieval tavern. You're not sleeping alone. You're not sleeping far from someone who snores like a dying accordion. Beds are often shared sometimes with complete strangers. 4 or 5 to a bed isn't uncommon. The logic, we're all people and it's warm. Also, you only paid a penny, and warmth doesn't come with personal space. There's a man with his boots still on. A woman snoring with a clay mug clutched to her chest, like a child, and a teenager talking in his sleep about sheep taxes. You scan the room. No bed has fewer than 3 people in it. One has 7, which is impressive, if not entirely explainable. The innkeeper gestures toward a space near the fire where a straw mat looks slightly less occupied. It's between a bald man humming in Latin and a young couple who appear to be arguing silently with their eyebrows. You take it. Now, getting into bed sounds simple, but in this context, it's more like auditioning for a spot in a medieval puzzle. You try to lay down quietly, but the straw cracks like thunder. The woman beside you mutters something that might be a spell. The bald man rolls over and breathes directly into your ear. It smells like onions and ancestral guilt. You settle in hands, crossed tightly over your pouch of coins which you've tied around your neck like a sad necklace. This is standard protocol. Theft was common, very common. So common that many travellers sewed valuables into their clothes or slept with a boot under their shirt just to keep someone from stealing it. The only locks here are the clenched jaws of the deeply asleep. Historians still debate whether this communal sleeping style built solidarity or psychological trauma. Maybe both. Some say it fostered kinship, people from all walks of life, sharing stories, warmth and lice. Others argue it was just the cheapest way to stack humans without shelving. Either way, you're now a sardine in a very noisy, very itchy tin. The conversation doesn't stop just because people are lying down. Someone is whispering about the mayor's affair. Another is describing a dream that somehow involves Firebread and his cousin. A child cries, a dog barks, and somewhere a bard is still quietly tuning his lute with the precision of a man who has never been threatened with silence. Eventually the candles are snuffed one by one, darkness descends, and then snoring, loud, relentless, orchestrated snoring. Each person in this room is conducting their own symphony of nasal misery. You close your eyes and try to drift off, but the man to your left shifts violently and knocks your elbow. The woman to your right just muttered, "Not again, Geoffrey," in her sleep. You decide you don't want to know. If you're lucky, you'll get a few hours of uncomfortable flea-infested sleep, interrupted only by coughing fits, nightmares, and the occasional flatulence duet. If not well, you'll simply lie awake in the dark, contemplating every decision that led to this moment, from trusting the stew to trusting the mattress. Let's not forget the bonus companions, mice and rats. Not large but enthusiastic. They skitter through the rafters and along the floor, occasionally brushing past your foot to remind you that this is in fact their inn. You're the guest. They're the legacy residents. And they don't snore, but they do judge. At some point you give up and stare at the ceiling. You think about the ale, the stew, the man who offered to sell you a blessed rock. And just as you begin to drift into something that might pass for sleep, a rooster crows. Rooster. It's still pitch black, and yet someone is up and yelling about missing boots. Another voice calls out for more ale. Someone in the corner is singing. It's not dawn, it's just another moment in the endless loop of tavern life. And you haven't even met the rules yet. You wake, or rather, you abandon your attempt to sleep, just in time to hear someone shouting, "No sword fighting before breakfast," which is, as it turns out, an actual house rule here. Or maybe just the innkeeper's desperate plea. Either way, you sit up, brush a questionable crumb from your sleeve, and wonder what fresh medieval nonsense awaits. Let's start with the basics. Medieval taverns did have rules, but they weren't printed on laminated cards in fine calligraphy. There were no polite reminders on the wall, no "please respect quiet hours" signs. These were rules you learned by either watching others or breaking them and getting hit with a stick. Literally. Many innkeepers kept a stick behind the counter for customer service. Rule number 1, pay on time or pay in blood, or rather, with collateral. Couldn't cover your ale. Well, the innkeeper might seize your boots, your belt, your sword, or that chicken you swore was just visiting. Records from 13th century England show travellers who didn't pay were stripped of everything but their dignity, and sometimes even that if they looked like they had extra. Some poor souls who couldn't settle their tab ended up mucking stables, hauling slop, or worse, cleaning chamber pots. Yes, those chamber pots, the ones placed conveniently under beds for nighttime emergencies and inconveniently forgotten by morning. It's a sobering experience to go from ale-drinking guest to someone intimately acquainted with medieval sanitation. Rule number 2, no weapons drawn indoors. This seems obvious now, but back then, when everyone was armed and nursing, emotions seasoned with warm ale and generational trauma, tavern brawls were practically a sport. Drawing a sword in some cities cost a fine of 20 shillings, more than a night's weekly room and board. But small knives, totally acceptable. Everyone had one. The same knife used for dinner could, and often did, become a pointy negotiation tool after the 10th verse of a drinking song. Now, historians still argue whether these laws were widely enforced or just creative ways for town councils to collect fines. In either case, you weren't allowed to duel in the dining hall, but let's just say that didn't always stop Geoffrey and his wildly misplaced confidence. Rule number 3, quiet after curfew. Most towns had a bell that rang around 9 p.m. in winter and 10 in summer. That bell meant no more revelry, doors locked, voices hushed. At least in theory. In practice, not so much. Smaller inns tried to obey, larger establishments, especially those hosting local officials, ignored it with a grin and a refill. You'll quickly find that the people who shout loudest about rules are the ones most likely to drunkenly dance on a table and kick over a candle. And in a building, mostly made of wood straw and dreams, that's how fires start. The quiet after curfew rule was in part an attempt to prevent mass combustion. It wasn't just about peace, it was about not waking up as charcoal. Rule number 4, don't steal from other guests. This also feels self-explanatory, until you realised that theft in taverns was a thriving business model. Some inns posted theft, not our problem disclaimers. Others offered to keep your valuables safely stored behind the bar, which in some cases was code for "we now own your necklace." That's why many travellers slept with their money bags tied around their waist or tucked into their shirt, developing a sixth sense for the sound of jingling that wasn't theirs. Some even wore their belts to bed, not for fashion, but to avoid waking up poor. You, by the way, did not think of this, and your coins are now suspiciously jingle-free. A man named Barto, whom you vaguely recall arguing with a cat last night, is humming and jingling quite a lot this morning. Coincidence? Probably not. Rule number 5. No disease, please. During plague years and flu seasons, taverns became the front line of public health enforcement. Travellers who coughed too much or looked vaguely contagious could be turned away on sight. In some towns, incoming guests had to wait outside city walls for days before being allowed in a kind of medieval quarantine zone, where you sat sneezed and watched your hopes slowly rot like bad cheese. Here's a fun side note. Some inns displayed talismans, dried herbs, or even taxidermied animals over their doors to ward off illness. One particularly creative inn in Flanders reportedly hung a desiccated goat's head above the fireplace as a guarantee of purity. Whether it worked or simply scared away faint-hearted guests is still up for debate. Of course, these rules weren't evenly enforced. A rich merchant could break everyone and receive nothing but a wink and a warm seat. A poor traveller could sneeze once and be booted out into the mud. That's the thing about medieval justice. It was swift, situational, and usually drunk. But there was also a kind of chaotic order to it all. Taverns weren't just rowdy drinking holes. They were mini-societies with hierarchies, traditions, and deeply confusing social codes. You could earn favour by buying drinks, lose it by questioning the stew, and gain mythical status by winning a brawl without spilling your ale. One peculiar practice still debated by scholars was the tavern trial. In some regions, if two guests accused each other of theft, they could agree to a public trial right in the tavern. This involved yelling insults, a few witnesses, and sometimes a goat as a character reference. The loser had to buy drinks for everyone and sleep in the stables. Justice was rough, ready, and mostly theatrical. You stand now stretching out the stiffness from sleeping like a medieval garden gnome and look around. Someone's sharpening a spoon, someone else is rubbing onion on their armpits, you don't ask. The tavern is alive again. Noisy, cranky, smelly, but alive. And just when you think you've survived the worst of it, a man near the door coughs. 3 people immediately step back. Someone mutters a prayer. The innkeeper raises an eyebrow. The rules are still in effect, and so is your lack of immunity. The cough echoes louder than any sword clash. You freeze, so does half the room. Even the goat, which has mysteriously upgraded itself to a windowsill, stares. You tell yourself it's just a little cough, a dry throat, a breadcrumb gone rogue. But in medieval taverns, a cough isn't just a cough. It's a siren, a threat, a whispered reminder that somewhere someone might be about to turn purple and take half the village with them. Let's be clear, you are now in a biological hazard zone. And you're not wearing a mask. You're wearing a tunic that hasn't been washed since it was handed down by your dead uncle, who possibly died of that same tunic. Congratulations. Taverns in the medieval world weren't just places of communal joy and drunken gambling, they were petri dishes. Crowded, smoky, poorly ventilated, with people from every possible village region and sanitary philosophy. You weren't just sharing stories, you were sharing immune systems, whether you liked it or not. Historically, travellers were one of the primary vectors for spreading disease. They came bearing news coins, spices, and the occasional sneeze that could collapse a monastery. It's part of why some towns instituted rules that required visitors to stay outside the city gates for days. Think of it as medieval curbside pickup, But instead of waiting for your Starbucks, you're trying not to die of the sweating sickness. You shift on your bench and try not to breathe too deeply, which is hard because the room still smells like old onions and someone's regret. Across from you, a man is sweating profusely. He raises a mug, smiles and silars, and says something about the stew cleansing the soul. His eyes are very wide. To your left, a woman scratches her arm with such purpose that you can almost hear her fleas composing a victory song. You shift away into the man behind you, who coughs again. And now it's official. You're in danger. Medieval inns had no soap, no hand sanitizer, no cover your mouth etiquette. People coughed openly, wiped their noses on sleeves, and thought bathing once a season was pushing it. Germ theory. Never heard of her. The best defence against illness, as far as anyone could tell, was loud prayer and strong ale, usually in that order. Let's pause for a quirky historical tidbit. In some Germanic regions, during plague outbreaks, inns hung bundles of garlic, dried flowers, and occasionally taxidermied weasels above doorways to purify the air. Historians still argue whether this worked or simply drove off guests with a low tolerance for rodent decor. Now back to your situation. You're seated between Mr. Cough and Miss Scabies, sipping from a communal mug and sharing bench space with 3 people who haven't so much as blinked in 15 minutes. You're starting to itch, and not psychologically. Real, tangible itching. Is it straw mites, fleas, guilt, all 3? You make a mental note to stop scratching, then immediately start scratching again. But surely you think there were medical checks, or healers, or at least someone walking around with a bucket of herbs? Not really. A tavern's idea of health protocol was watching for visible buboes and sniffing the air for danger. If someone had boils, they were asked politely to dine outside. If they sneezed on the stew pot, well, congratulations, that pot is now Wednesday stew. And even if you were obviously sick, there was nowhere to isolate. The sleeping room is one big haystack of human soup. You just roll over and hope your breath didn't aim at anyone important. The worst part, you're starting to feel warm. Could be the fire, could be the ale, could be the early onset of something historical. You try to take comfort in the fact that people around you seem perfectly fine. Then you realise that several of them look half dead and just haven't noticed yet. You cough once carefully, softly, a test cough. 3 people look at you. The innkeeper narrows his eyes. A large man named Ulfric, who may or may not be part bear, leans in and asks, "That a sick cough or a stew cough?" You blink. "There's a difference," he says, thumping his chest. "Sick coughs are wet. Stew coughs are thick." You assure him it was the stew. He nods satisfied and slides you a pickled egg that looks like it lost a fight. "Good," he says. "We don't want another incident." You don't ask about the incident. Instead, you try to make yourself invisible, which is difficult given that your clothes are too clean, your boots don't squish, and you're not currently arguing with a hallucination. Let's not forget about the rodents. They're not just scenery, they're active participants. Mice in the rafters, rats under the bench. The one next to your foot is either dead or playing an extremely convincing game of medieval possum. These animals are not just tolerated, they're basically part of the furniture, and they're very healthy, suspiciously healthy. Historians have found evidence of tavern ceilings lined with straw, supposedly for insulation, but probably also to muffle the sound of squeaking. Some inns even kept cats to manage the rodents, though the cats, being medieval, mostly just judged everyone and refused to work. Still, somehow no one seems worried. The laughter continues. A man claps you on the back with a hand sticky from something unholy. Another insists you try the pickled carrots, they keep the demons out. And a small child is chasing a pig across the floor. You're not sure if the pig is dinner a pet or the entertainment. And maybe this is the real danger, not the coughing or the vermin or the stew-induced delusions. Maybe it's how quickly this all starts to feel normal. How easily you stop noticing the straw in your hair, the bites on your ankles, the odd rash forming under your collar. You're adapting, and that's the scariest part. Still, if you're going to die in a medieval tavern, it might as well be tonight. There's ale in your mug, warmth by the fire, and a bard in the corner tuning his lute with something approaching professionalism. Just try not to exhale too deeply, because next it's game night. If you thought mealtime was a gamble, wait until you actually gamble. In a medieval tavern, games weren't cute little distractions. They were high-stakes, low-skill, emotional roller coasters, lubricated by ale and the occasional head injury. Dice was the game of choice, and by dice we mean small cubes, many hopes, and very few winners. Tonight's game table is less of a table and more of a plank that's been balanced on two barrels and wiped with someone's sleeve. The crowd around it is loud, leaning in like vultures who just saw a knight drop his coin pouch. You're invited, or rather dragged, to join. Someone hands you a pair of dice. They feel suspiciously warm. 2 pence buying a man with a scar across his nose, mutters, not breaking eye contact. You nod, reach for your pouch. Remember? It's missing. Then pat your tunic until a sympathetic onlooker slides you a coin for luck. There's no such thing as generosity in this room, so you assume it's poisoned or cursed. But you take it anyway, because peer pressure is eternal. The game begins. It's simple. Throw the dice, hope for the best, and try not to accuse anyone of cheating unless you're faster than them and can fit through small windows. And if you lose, don't worry, your dignity is already on the floor, somewhere between the goat and the firewood. The room erupts with every throw. Cheers, groan, accusations. One man swears the dice are cursed. Another counters that he is cursed. A third insists everyone here is cursed and bets another copper on it. You roll a 7. Apparently that's good, until the scar-nosed man rolls an 8 and slaps the table with the force of a minor earthquake. That's when the shouting starts. Medieval gambling didn't come with regulations. No house edge, no pit boss, no laminated rules. Just raw emotions, creative math, and the ever-present threat of a fist to the jaw. People bet coins, trinkets, chickens' future favours, and once, according to a 14th century record, a single shoe left or right unspecified. One quirky tidbit: in some regions, gamblers carried small wax tablets to record debts. These tavern ledgers were notorious for being wildly inaccurate and occasionally edible. Historians still debate whether they were ever truly used or just waved around to impress nearby maidens. Meanwhile, in your game, someone accuses the bard of singing a luck-stealing tune. The bard responds by rhyming dice with lice, which doesn't help. A man throws his mug. It misses, hitting a beam above your head, releasing a shower of dust and possibly mouse droppings. The crowd roars. You roll again, double 3s. You're back in the game, and you pretend to know what that means. Scarnose growls. The tension thickens. Behind him, a man named Willem, who's either drunk or an amateur philosopher, announces loudly, "Life is just dice, my friends. God rolls us every morning and curses half by noon." This gets a cheer, or maybe a sneeze, you're not sure anymore. Then someone loses badly, like dramatically badly. A coin purse slams on the table. Accusations fly. The bard starts playing something ominous in D minor. Everyone knows what's coming, the tavern brawl. It starts with a finger jab, then a mug, then a bench goes over, and suddenly you're in the middle of a historical reenactment of what not to do in a bar. You duck, you weave, you briefly lock eyes with the goat, who seems to disapprove. A spoon flies past your face. Someone pulls your hood down over your eyes. You hear the sound of a lute being used in a very unmusical way. Here's the thing. Tavern brawls were not rare. In fact, they were so common that towns passed ordinances requiring weapons be left at the door, like medieval coat checks, but for swords. The fact that such laws existed proves they were needed, frequently. And still, despite the risk of bruises, broken noses, and someone biting your ankle, because that's my fighting style, brawls were part of the culture. A fight over dice normal. A dispute about stew consistency, understandable. Someone insulted someone else's hat duel time. You crawl under a table, heart racing, holding a mug like a shield, and praying to every saint whose name you can remember, including Saint Barkeep, who probably isn't canon but deserves to be. Then miraculously the innkeeper intervenes. He appears with a stick longer than a broom and wider than your dignity, and slams it on a table hard enough to silence the room and possibly realign your spine. Everyone freezes. He snarls something about "not again," and slowly, sheepishly, people return to their seats. You emerge from under the table like a newborn calf, covered in dust, ego bruised, stew-scented, and slightly dizzy. Scarnose pats you on the back like you just got knighted. "Good sport," he says. "You didn't even cry." You smile, weakly, because you know that was only one round. There will be more. There are always more. In fact, now that the fists have cooled and the ale is refilled, someone suggests another game. This one involving cards made from flattened parchment scraps and more rules than the Magna Carta. You pass politely. You've survived your first tavern fight. You're not eager to collect the full set. But as the dice start rolling again and the crowd resumes their ritual cheering, you can't help but feel a twisted kind of joy. This place is lawless loud and liable to cause permanent dental trauma. But it's alive, real, and now, unfortunately, you're not just a visitor. You're part of the tavern, just in time for the nightly entertainment, just when you think the chaos might subside. After all the stew has been slurped, the dice have been rolled, and the guy in the corner has stopped bleeding, you hear it, the bard's first chord. It echoes through the room like a medieval fire alarm, and everyone perks up. The atmosphere pivots from brawl-ready tension to a communal exhale. Mugs are raised, benches are dragged closer, and someone lights a torch with the kind of enthusiasm normally reserved for revolution or cheese. Welcome to Entertainment Hour, which in a medieval tavern is less Broadway and more whatever survived the road, and has a song or a juggling chicken. You're about to witness an ever-shifting performance lineup that includes minstrels, jesters, spontaneous songs, audience heckling, and sometimes interpretive sneezing. The bard begins with a classic ballad about an unfaithful knight, a disappointed goose, and a cursed chamber pot. You don't understand half the lyrics, but neither does anyone else. That's not the point. The point is to laugh when the rhymes land cheer, when the bard winks and clap rhythmically, until someone gets too drunk and starts clapping in 7/8 time. Jesters occasionally tour through offering jokes, riddles, and the kind of acrobatics that make you question how recently they've had a head injury. One hops onto a table, attempts a backflip and lands in a bucket. No one helps him out. This is part of the act, probably. Historically, taverns were important venues for travelling performers. Itinerant minstrels carried news, satire, and regional gossip in song form. They were Twitter threads set to a lute. One quirky tidbit: some minstrels compose songs mocking local officials, then perform them under pseudonyms, like Guy Who Definitely Isn't Jeff from Market Street. Records show that in some towns, singing about the mayor's weight could land you in stocks, or get you a free drink depending on the crowd. Tonight's crowd is lively. The ale has softened their skepticism. Someone begins clapping along to the beat with a spoon and a trencher. Another taps the table with a knife, producing a rhythm that could summon demons. A woman with a voice like aged wine stands up to sing a verse of her own, and the tavern quiets for the first time in hours. Her ballad is slow melancholy about lost love and a stolen sheep, though it's hard to tell which hurts more. And then the laughter returns, because the next song is a raucous drinking anthem with a chorus so bawdy it could curdle milk. Everyone joins in, including the goat, especially the goat. You're starting to enjoy this, genuinely. Despite the fleas, the stew, the bruises forming on your left side from earlier bench combat, you feel part of something. There's a rhythm to the madness, a strange, joyful resilience. But make no mistake, it's not all song and merriment. There's an edge beneath it, always. The innkeeper keeps an eye on the room like a captain on a leaky ship. The bard occasionally glances toward the door, and you've noticed that some of the loudest singers never touch their mugs. They're watching, calculating, listening for an opportunity or a secret. Because in medieval taverns, entertainment wasn't just for fun, it was a smokescreen. Beneath the laughter deals were made, gossip was gathered, wealth was measured not just by your coin pouch, but by who sat with you and how close. One man sidles up beside you, offers you a crumb of cheese that might technically still be food, and leans in. You hear about the merchant in Redcliffe. He asks, mouth moving faster than his thoughts. Lost a whole shipment of silk, or said he did. Word is he's hiding the good stuff till prices rise. Greedy, that one. You nod as if this means something to you. It doesn't. But now you're part of the network. Another man shuffles by, pretending to fix his sandal, and whispers, "Watch the bard. He's got a second knife in his boot." You glance. He does. Why, unknown. Entertainment or insurance policy. Also unknown. But you're learning fast in a medieval tavern knowing is surviving. And now a new act. A fire juggler enters. Yes, indoors. In a building made of dried beams, flammable dreams, and 14 layers of spilled ale. The crowd cheers. Someone starts singing again. The juggler lights his torches with dramatic flair and promptly sets his own sleeve on fire. A woman tosses ale on him, successfully extinguishing the flame and ruining her evening drink. Cheers all around. Historians still argue whether this kind of impromptu entertainment was planned or just what happened when too much mead met not enough adult supervision. Some suggest tavern performances helped preserve oral histories. Others suspect they were just excuses for noise that wasn't crying. You glance around. Your bench companion is asleep face down in a plate of pickled turnips. The jester is now trying to juggle eggs and failing gloriously. The bard shifts into a slower tune, something haunting. The kind of song that makes the hairs on your arm rise like they're listening. And just like that, the room softens again. Mugs lower, voices hush. Even the goat stops chewing on someone's sleeve. The song is about war, about distance, about a brother who never came home. And though you don't know the words, you understand, because that's what this chaos is for. Not just noise, not just distraction. It's how they remember, how they forget, how they make it through another night of mystery meat, communal mattresses, and economic uncertainty, so intense even the ale is anxious. The song ends, no applause, just quiet. Then someone breaks wind loudly, and the spell is shattered. Back to laughter. The bard bows, the room erupts again. The jester climbs the fireplace. Someone starts dancing with a broom. And just as you think you've seen it all, the innkeeper claps his hands once. Hard, loud, the sound cuts the noise like a blade. Enough, time for beds. He's serious. You wonder if anyone will actually sleep, or if something else entirely is coming. You thought bedtime was behind you, that you'd already tangled with the straw-stuffed mattresses, the symphony of snorers, the ambient fleas and the occasional philosophical mouse. But tonight, something is different. The laughter has dimmed, the entertainment has been packed away, or passed out under a table. And now the real show begins, the art of surviving the night. The innkeeper extinguishes a few torches, not all, just enough to plunge the room into murky twilight. Shadows stretch long, the kind of darkness where you're not sure if that shape in the corner is a pile of cloaks or a particularly patient criminal. Guests begin to claim spaces like land-hungry nobles. Benches are flipped, tables are cleared. The central hall, so recently a dinner floor and musical arena, transforms into one great tangle of bodies, bedrolls, limbs, and dignity hemorrhaging quietly into the floorboards. But you notice something curious. A man slips away through a side door, then another. A woman taps a coin to her teeth, nods to someone, and vanishes behind a curtain. You, being curious and still semi-functional from ale, follow. Because while the front of the inn sleeps, the back of the inn negotiates. You stumble into what could generously be called a hallway, though it's more like a very ambitious broom closet. Lanterns flicker, whispers dance across the walls like moths. You pass by rooms, not bedrooms, but side chambers, with thick curtains instead of doors. Inside you glimpse hushed conversations, coin changing hands, ledgers being marked. And there's the innkeeper again. But this time, he's not grunting at you over stew. He's laughing genuinely, with two men in cloaks who carry no visible weapons and make no noise when they move. You back away instinctively, because whatever deals are being made back here, they are not on the menu. Welcome to the underworld of the tavern, a space where local crime meets travelling opportunity, where thieves, smugglers, informants, and occasionally clergy exchange more than gossip. If the tavern is the heart of the town, this backroom is the artery clogged with secrets and money. You always thought criminals met in dark alleyways wearing hoods and whispering in code. Here they're in plain sight, toasting each other and complaining about stew. It's almost casual. Here's a little-known historical gem. Some innkeepers didn't just allow crime. They managed it. They curated it. Like sommeliers of sin, they matched desperate travellers with available pickpockets, arranged fencing of stolen goods, even assigned which guest would be robbed that evening, based on who looked the least stabby. There are documented cases, especially in 14th century England, where innkeepers stood trial for orchestrating complex theft rings, not just letting it happen, running it. One famous example involved an inn near Canterbury, where the owner routinely drugged travellers' ale and looted their belongings while they snored. He called it night pruning, very agricultural, very illegal. And here's you fresh meat, slightly drunk, and absolutely in the wrong corridor. You turn around quickly, or at least you try to, because now you realise there's someone behind you. A woman, maybe mid-30s, wearing the kind of smile that suggests she knows which pocket your last coin is in. Looking for something, she asks. You blurt out no. Even better, she grins. Come with me. This is how it starts. Not with a mugging, but with a conversation. You're steered back into the main room, where she makes a show of guiding you toward a less crowded corner and tossing down an extra bedroll. Generous, right, wrong. In the language of taverns, generosity is just the prelude to billing. She sits nearby, watches, doesn't speak again. And you realise this is protection, the medieval kind. You've been tagged as a client, which means no one else in this room will rob you. Yet. Because she gets first pick. Welcome to tavern economics. You lie down, close your eyes, try not to think about your coin pouch or whether she's still watching or why the bard is now sleeping with one eye open. And of course you still have your fellow guests to contend with. One is snoring loud enough to rearrange your spine. Another talks in his sleep, mumbling something about grain taxes and being chased by a duck. Someone nearby is praying very quietly and very intensely, which is either comforting or alarming, depending on how much you've sinned today. At some point in the night, the floor creaks. That's not unusual. Then something brushes your ankle. Also not unusual. Then you hear soft footsteps, very slow, very careful. You don't open your eyes. You do what every sane person in a medieval inn does when something unexplained moves. In the dark, you freeze, you fake sleep, and you hope whoever it is likes easier targets. The footsteps fade. You exhale, but you don't sleep, because now your mind is awake to the realities of the tavern's darker side. This place isn't just a resting point for weary travellers. It's a hunting ground, a negotiation table, a roulette wheel spun by moonlight. And that smiling woman, she's already asleep, or pretending. Her coin pouch is neatly tucked beneath her. Smart. You'll remember that. But for now, just rest your head on your itchy, lumpy pillow. Listen to the choir of snorers. Try to ignore the faint metallic jingle somewhere in the dark. Tomorrow you might not have boots, and if you do, they might not be your boots. But one thing is certain, you'll wake up in the medieval version of a social experiment, and you're already part of it. Now roll over carefully, because next comes the lesson in how social ladders are mostly rungs to trip on. Morning arrives without grace. There is no sunrise serenade, no birdsong, no kindly innkeeper tapping on your door with fresh bread and a jug of milk. Instead, you are awakened by a loud fart, a rooster crowing indoors, and the alarming realization that someone's foot is halfway into your tunic. You open your eyes. The room is a battlefield. Blankets are strewn like fallen banners. One man is face down in a puddle of ale. Another is trying to remember where his boots went, and a third is arguing with a chicken about personal space. You sit up slowly, realizing that your neck is sore, your back is furious, and your dignity has wandered off sometime in the night. And just when you think you're safe from further shocks, you see it, a servant girl, shaking a bucket of slop with more authority than a knight with a battle axe. She's barefoot no more than 16 and carries herself with the grim efficiency of someone who's seen things. She gives you a look that says, "You are in my way, and if you don't move, I will pour this stew-like substance directly into your lap." Welcome to the social ladder of the medieval tavern, where titles mean nothing, wealth means everything, and gender determines the rules of the game, most of which are unfair, and all of which are enforced by tired people with strong wrists. Let's start at the top, the innkeeper, a combination landlord, bouncer, chef smuggler, gossip monger, and occasional priest. The innkeeper is king here. He decides who eats first, who sleeps where, and who gets kicked out when the goat finds something under your bedroll. Wealth buys favour, regulars get nods, strangers get scrutinised, and anyone who questions the stew gets silence followed by a cold stare, followed by stew. Anyway, directly beneath the innkeeper are the trusted regulars. These are locals who basically live here. Traders, messengers, retired mercenaries with too many scars and not enough morals. They don't pay for ale because they've prepaid with stories, favours, or intimate blackmail material. They sit in the same seats every night, shout the same jokes, and get away with behaviour that would get anyone else thrown through a shutter. Then come the entertainers, bards, jesters, travelling minstrels. They're outsiders, yes, but tolerated, revered even. For a few hours they control the room. Their value is measured in laughs and distractions. But once the loot is packed and the crowd goes to bed, they're as disposable as last night's trencher. Unless, of course, they know something worth selling. And then the servants. Ah yes, the invisible hands who keep the tavern from collapsing into literal filth. Often women, often girls, often unpaid. They haul buckets, mop floors, chase goats, scrub stains from benches that should not have stains, and somehow carry 12 trenchers at once while dodging gropes, threats and playful slaps from men who deserve to be hit with something heavier than a spoon. One quirky historical note: in some cities, tavern maids were required by local ordinances to wear specific colours or aprons, not to honour their service, but to identify them as non-mistress class, i.e. touchable. Let that sink in. There were literal dress codes for being disrespected, and yet these same women could wield incredible power, social power. A well-placed eye roll from a barmaid could ostracise a traveller. A shared secret whispered between tankards could get someone thrown out or into someone's bed. They knew everything. Who arrived late, who paid in silver, who didn't pay at all. Then you had the unofficial categories: the drunk, the suspiciously quiet, the sad, the thief disguised as a pilgrim, and the pilgrim disguised as a thief. You meanwhile are sitting squarely in the newcomer, who might be robbed, married off, or hired for something illegal by sundown tier. You stretch, rise to your feet and try to blend in. You offer to help the servant girl with her bucket. She raises an eyebrow, hands it to you, and watches as you nearly dislocate a shoulder. It's heavier than your regrets. She smirks and goes back to clearing the sleeping bodies with nudges and muttered insults that could blister paint. And then there are the women travellers, a particularly complicated slice of society. A woman travelling alone in a tavern was either incredibly brave, incredibly rich, or part of a very specific profession. Depending on how she dressed, stood or declined to smile, she was judged, protected, harassed. Sometimes, all three by the same person in the same sentence. You notice one such woman near the fire, cloaked, seated with her back to the wall, spooning stew into her mouth like it owes her money. No one sits too close, no one speaks to her, but they all notice her. She locks eyes with you briefly. You look away quickly, as if your eyeballs just committed a social faux pas. In medieval taverns, status wasn't always declared, it was sensed. Posture, clothing, scars, accent, even how you held your mug could tell others how to treat you. Were you a knight, a runaway, a merchant, a liar? The tavern would decide. And of course, money talks loudly. Coins could buy privacy, or betrayal, or a better corner of straw to sleep on. A traveller who tipped well was protected until their pouch was empty. Then they became tomorrow's stew anecdote. Historians still argue whether these taverns were true melting pots or just pressure cookers with a few open vents. Some describe them as early prototypes for democracy, everyone under one roof sharing bread and song. Others say they were theatre staged, loud and full of people, pretending not to be scared sick or slowly starving. But you know one thing for sure, no one in here is unimportant. Even the drunk in the corner might have been a lord last year. Even the quiet child sweeping the ashes might grow up to be the bard who sings about you someday. You step back into the main room. Breakfast is a cold chunk of bread and the promise of meat later. No one says what kind of meat. You don't ask. The innkeeper walks by, claps you on the back and mutters, "Still alive, I see." You nod, barely, because before you leave this place or try to, you've got one more lesson to learn. And it's hiding in plain sight. The tavern isn't just a place. It's a network, a broadcast station, a medieval internet cafe with fewer mice. Actually, no more mice, but also more news. The air is thick with the scent of sour ale, burnt porridge, and the unmistakable tang of someone cleaning themselves with a turnip. But beneath all that, layered into the muttering, the coughing, the clinking of pewter mugs, is something more valuable than a warm bench or even a half-identifiable piece of meat information. In the medieval tavern, news didn't travel by parchment. It travelled by drunkards. Every laugh was a headline. Every whispered slur was a potential scandal. And every traveller, yourself included, was a carrier pigeon with extremely poor hygiene and no idea what kind of secrets they were leaking. You sit at the edge of a communal table, nibbling on a crust of bread so hard it might be a weapon, and listen, because that's what smart people do in taverns. They listen. Loud guests are entertaining. Quiet guests are dangerous. But the ones who listen, they leave richer or at least better informed. To your left, a spice merchant from the south is loudly complaining about a bandit toll near a crossroads. 12 pennies just to pass, and my donkey didn't even get a receipt, he grumbles, slamming his mug down. People nod. Someone adds that the bandits are working with the local sheriff. Another says the sheriff is the bandit. To your right, 2 young men are whispering about ships. One claims he saw sails painted with black dragons, docking in a coastal village 2 weeks ago. Not pirates, he insists. Merchants. But strange ones, didn't speak any tongue I knew. The other leans in closer, eyes wide, and mutters something about sorcery and spice roots, and then the innkeeper strolls past, muttering under his breath. Funny how the bishop eats twice what he tithes. You pretend not to hear, but the seed is planted. Taverns were the medieval world's newsrooms, messy, inebriated, poorly edited, but efficient. When a town crier shouted news in the square, it was filtered, censored, political. But in a tavern, the truth was served with a side of spit and sarcasm. If you wanted real news, you got it from a woman with a scar across her nose and a memory like a ledger. In fact, many professional messengers used taverns as relay stations. They'd ride for hours, then stop to eat drink and casually mention what they heard in the last village. Messages would hop from town to town like Gossip frogs altered slightly at every stop until a minor dispute became a holy war and a merchant's delayed cart turned into a murder plot. There's a fun little historical footnote here. In 15th century German territories, some taverns were officially designated as postal stops. Certain innkeepers were even paid stipends by local rulers to hold and forward messages. A pint of ale could be delivered with a side of papal intrigue, and no one batted an eye except maybe the messenger's horse, which hadn't had a decent stable since Prague. You take another bite of your brick-shaped bread and realise the bard has returned not to sing but to talk. He leans casually against the hearth, drinks from a mug the size of a helmet, and begins sharing rumours. Not songs, not stories. Rumours, the real show. 3 towns west, they say a noble son vanished. Just gone. No ransom, no note. He pauses, sips, and his mother's hiring seers now. Real ones, not the kind who read turnips. The room leans in. Someone asks, was it love or debt? The bard shrugs. Might have been wolves, or worse. The theories begin to fly. You nod along. You've never been to that town. Don't know the noble and have no seer on speed dial, but it doesn't matter. By morning this story will be yours. You'll retell it 3 inns from now, with a slight limp and a dramatic sigh, because that's how power worked here, not just in swords and coin, but in narrative. Whoever controlled the story controlled the room, and the tavern was where stories grew legs, arms, sometimes wings. Facts were flexible, truth was negotiable. But if you were clever, you could learn more in 1 night at a tavern than in a month of sober prayer. You excuse yourself to refill your mug, walking past 2 old women in the corner, arguing about whose cousin had the worse exorcism. As you pass, one of them glances at you and hisses, "He's the one from the north, isn't he?" You have no idea what she means. You smile, nod, continue on. The innkeeper eyes you. You listening for fun or for sale? You freeze. For a terrifying second, you think you've been outed as a spy or worse, a tax collector. "I'm listening to remember," you say. He nods just once and returns to polishing a tankard that may or may not have had stew in it last night. This place, this chaotic, smelly, loud, sleep-depriving ecosystem, is more than a rest stop. It's a crossroads. Every story in the region passes through here, if only to lose a boot and pick up a strange itch. Deals are made here, marriages arranged, murders sometimes planned, sometimes confessed, occasionally sung about by bards with good rhymes and bad ethics. You overhear a whispered transaction in the corner, something about horses, another about coins with odd markings. And at the bar, a man asks for a room, but refuses to give his name. The innkeeper doesn't push, he never does. Some scholars argue that taverns like this were the birthplace of political resistance, that revolts, rebellions, and revolutions began over mugs and murmurings. Others say that's nonsense, that nothing dangerous could possibly originate from a man in a fur tunic singing about trout. But you're not so sure. This place hums with tension, with knowledge, with people who have just enough information to be interesting and just enough desperation to be useful. You sit back down, mug in hand, ears wide open, and you realise with a shiver the real danger in this tavern isn't the stew or the lice or even the dice. It's the secrets. And the next one might be about you, which is unfortunate timing, because just as you plan to slip out unnoticed, someone shouts your description. You freeze mid-sip, the warm ale suddenly tasting less like barley and more like panic. Someone at the far end of the tavern, bearded, broad, and apparently very comfortable, yelling indoors, has just described you down to the last threadbare seam of your borrowed cloak. Seen him, blue tunic, awkward boots, smells like goat, but walks like he hasn't met one. Half the room turns to look. The other half was already looking, but now they're focused. The inn goes quiet. Not silent, there's still a goat chewing in the background, and someone is humming without realising, but quiet enough that you suddenly feel every eye press against your skin like a hot iron. You clear your throat, laugh nervously and raise your mug. Sounds handsome, you joke. No one laughs. Because in a medieval tavern, being noticed is rarely a compliment. It means someone's been watching, remembering, waiting. And now the tavern at the place you thought was just stew, snoring, and songs has decided you are today's subplot. The man who shouted steps forward. He's big, not fat, just dense, like if a barrel of bread dough learned how to win bar fights. Didn't expect you to make it this far, he says, eyeing you like you're both dessert and paperwork. You weigh your options. Stand, run, pretend to faint, offer to clean the stables for the next week. You glance at the bard, he immediately looks away. Typical. Before you can speak, the innkeeper grunts from the corner. He doesn't say much, but his one-word commands carry the weight of local law and several unpaid debts. Enough, he growls. Everyone watches. The big man pauses, then laughs. Just jesting, he says, clapping your back hard enough to realign your shoulder. Thought you were someone else. The tension breaks. Barely. A few nervous chuckles, a relieved snort. The bard starts strumming again, very slowly, as if unsure whether to play a ballad or a dirge. You sit back down, trying not to visibly shake, and that's when it hits you. This place doesn't forget. You might pass through. You might think you're anonymous, but the tavern remembers. It remembers who paid, who didn't, who won the dice game, who whispered about the tax collector, who looked nervous when the fire juggler showed up, and who smelled like they were from elsewhere. Inns like this one were the nervous system of the medieval world. They held its fears, its gossip, its minor acts of rebellion and major stomach aches. You couldn't write history without including taverns, because this is where the world happened. And you've now officially happened here. You're part of the inn's collective memory. Maybe as the traveller who survived a stew. Maybe as the guy who almost got dragged outside before breakfast. Maybe as the one who talked to the woman with the scary smile and survived. You think back on all of it, the coughing, the dice, the mattress made of straw, and regret the stew that may or may not have included feathers. The rules, the songs, the secrets. And just as you're beginning to feel nostalgic, someone knocks over a candle. It hits the floor. Sparks kiss the dry rushes. A scream, then scrambling. Fire. Because of course, why end the night peacefully when you can reenact a medieval emergency response scenario? Panic erupts. Ale is tossed. People shout, "Get water," without any follow-up on where that water is. A man tries to smother the flame with his cloak, which immediately ignites. Someone throws a bench. It hits another bench. Now the benches are fighting too. This is not the first time this has happened. The innkeeper grabs a barrel, the emergency barrel it seems, and douses the fire with one angry throw. Smoke billows, the goat coughs. Crisis averted, barely. Everyone settles. No one leaves, because this is normal. Fires happen. Theft happens. Plague happens. The stew mysteriously, always, happens. And yet these places endured. They burned, they rebuilt, they evolved. Some of Europe's oldest functioning hotels were once taverns, just like this loud, dangerous, weirdly sentimental arenas of human drama. They adapted because people needed them. Needed a roof, a rumour, a bowl of something vaguely edible and warm. You finish the last of your ale. You stand. The bard nods. The woman in the corner tilts her head ever so slightly. The innkeeper says nothing. And as you step outside into the cool morning air, you realise something strange. You'd come back. You'd absolutely come back. Not for the food, or the beds, or the lice, but because nowhere else gives you this much of the world this quickly, with this many confusing smells. You walk away a little wiser, a little itchier, and a lot more medieval than you were yesterday. And now as the noise of the tavern fades behind you, and the night air settles cool against your skin, you exhale, slowly, letting go of the stew, the laughter, the uncomfortable mattress, and the juggler, who never quite learned when to stop. You're out of the inn, but it lingers in the scratches on your arms, the smoke in your hair, and that faint sense that someone somewhere is still singing about you badly. The world outside is quiet, dark, but safe in a strange way. There's no dice clattering, No ale sloshing, no barmaids swearing under their breath. Just stars. You've survived something truly odd and oddly unforgettable. A medieval tavern, part danger, part theatre, part very long and messy conversation. And somehow you belonged there. So breathe in again, let your shoulders drop, let your mind wander back to the flickering hearth, the rickety bench, the bard's off-key melody. And if you ever find yourself in that world again, cold, lost, tired, don't look for a castle. Find the nearest tavern, even if the stew's gone strange, even if the bench creaks, even if there's a goat in your bed. Because in the medieval world, chaos is comfort and the inn is home. Sweet dreams.